Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's BAFTA session on animation. The session itself will become animated halfway through, and we're going to swap over the panels, but we're going to start with the team from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. We've got Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the producers, and Peter Ramsey, Rodney Rotham, and Bob Persichetti, the directors.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
I want to start by asking you how this team came together, because you've all got different specialisms within animation and outside animation as well. And I'm really interested in who was the kind of nexus point of this, and how did the rest kind of all form around?
Well, it started 4 years ago when Amy Pascal and Avi Arad suggested to Phil and I doing an animated Spider-Man movie. And at first we thought, maybe there have been a lot of Spider-Man movies already, but then we thought more about it, and we thought, well, you could tell the story of Miles Morales, and that would be a interesting and fresh way to take on that myth, and it would be an opportunity to make something that felt like nothing you've ever seen before, and make animation, like push the medium to feel like it was a living comic book. So then Phil ended up writing a script. Then we brought Bob on first.
I came on 2015.
At the treatment
2015
stage.
Treatment level. Yeah, we didn't have a script. Yeah, treatment level.
It became very obvious that it was incredibly ambitious and would be unable. We needed more help. Peter was doing storyboards on it.
Peter was boarding on it while directing something else that unfortunately didn't work out.
Or was it
unfortunate? So he ended up, like, he was doing boards on the side for us, and then he just came on. It was super easy.
And then we left town, and the script still needed some work. So Rodney came on and did a pass on the script and did such an amazing job. We were like, please help us. We still need more help. And so we invited him to join the club, and then there you go.
Yeah. And all films should have at least 3 directors. That's our philosophy.
You've been doing it wrong this whole time.
We're
like
camera?
a once-in-a-generation talent. Either one is fine.
Give or take.
Was there any pushback to the incredible complexity of this idea? Because, I mean, the thing is, Chris, as you said, there's been so many Spider-Man films already. Mm-hmm. It feels like we've sort of seen semi-definitive versions of that character. And weirdly, I felt, by watching yours, which tries to be kind of anything but definitive, it actually gets to the core of what Spider-Man is about. Maybe better than the previous live-action ones, for me certainly. But just the sheer kind of complexity of that, did the studio kind of say, well, hold on a minute, we're having how many characters?
I mean, broadly, no. Broadly, the studio supported, the ways that the movie was distinctive, because the movie had to be distinctive, to differentiate itself from other things, and strangely, one of the biggest moments in our movie's evolution was when the other Spider-Man movie came out and was wildly successful, because it meant that we had to try even harder to be different and to emphasize the things that we could do that no one else could do. So the only time, like on any movie, the only time we got pushback is if maybe we were trying to do something that was really expensive, and and maybe that was a conversation. But generally, I'd say we were supported in trying different things.
Mm. Yeah, it was a support that was on the creative side that was always there, and then on the production side, it was just, wait, you guys want to do what? Okay, we don't but we've spent 20 years trying to not do that. So there was just a little bit of there was some discomfort at first. Not there was resistance, but it was just like, well, there's a reason why all these things exist in our pipeline. Mm-hmm. And we were sort of making rules that were sort of counter to everything they had learned for 20 years, and we were trying to shake things up with mm-hmm. that. So that was the only resistance. And then it was just, it did take about 18 months to get about 2 seconds of what the film would look like moving. Mm-hmm. So that was also it wasn't due to resistance, it was due to just constant sort of iteration and failures and successes and building on those.
Mm-hmm. Talk me through how you settled on that visual style then, because I mean, clearly this idea of bringing the comic book to the screen in a way in which it still is, it has that kind of visual texture of a comic book completely intuitively built into the image. How hard was it to land on? I mean, is it possible to push that idea too far in which it just becomes completely visually unintelligible? And I see the storyboard guy nodding.
No, that was my concern going in when we were first talking about our ambitions for what it could look like. And you're always worried that, well, if we lean too heavily on style, are we going to sort of smother the substance? If we've got to find the big challenge for us, most of the way through the process was finding the balance between this really, hopefully new, bold style that we were going for, and still landing all the emotional subtleties and the emotional, a grounded emotional tone for the movie, which was really important for us. And we had a brilliant production designer, Justin Thompson, and the guys at Sony ImageWorks were able to really collaborate with us, and there was a lot of it really evolved through, again, like Bob said, this is iteration upon iteration upon iteration, kind of homing in on something. I mean, one of our biggest challenges was, what do people look like, walking around in the daytime? We didn't know that for like a year and a half.
So
and we're
good
like,
at doing
oh,
this
God.
in the dark. It looked great with the lights off.
The first 3 sequences were all very dark.
Yes. Very intentional.
And often in masks.
Yeah, I mean, it was like human faces and hands and skin. The idea that you were going to texture it with, half-tone Band-Aid dots and hatch marks for the shadows and painterly textures is a lot easier on backgrounds, which we've seen stylized in 2D for years, but on a 3D moving character with subtly their faces on the light and where the light changes on their face. The dots on a person's face can look like acne if it's stuck to the face, and if it's not stuck to the face, it can be distractingly swarming around. So it was this very, very long process.
The still frames looked amazing.
Right.
But
Moving, it was garbage.
Yeah.
And it was trying to figure out how to make it move and look good.
And then the process of CG and hand-drawn animation together ended up being incredibly bespoke and labor-intensive, which meant every frame had to be both animated in CG and then subsequently drawn by hand. So normally it would take an animator, in a week they could do about 4 seconds on average for a normal movie, and this you could get about 1 second of footage done in a week. So it was. I wish that we had figured out a faster way by the end, but
failed.
But no.
I think at the end we had such a large crew and everybody was sort of in their zone, and they were getting maybe we got 2 seconds out of some people a week, which was a huge deal. It helped. Yeah, it seems ridiculous right now, but it was a big deal. We were cheering.
on that point of reconciling these different styles, something, even having seen the film, that I don't really understand how it works, is this idea of animating the characters on 2s and the background at 24 frames. I mean, where on earth did that idea come from, and how do you reconcile those?
I mean, honestly, that idea was born out of what traditional. The first place I worked out of college was Disney, and I was lucky enough to assist Glenn Keane on Tarzan and some other things, and it was just that. It was like hand-drawn animation, was always 12 images per second, which is 24 frames of film, right? So something could stay on the screen for 2 frames and your eye doesn't perceive that it's sticking. 3, it starts to pick that up. But when CGI animation came into being, it for many different reasons, it became something that was moving where you had 24 images per second. And each one was moving, and a lot of it had to do with, this hair needs to move realistically, or this cloth needs to move realistically. And so they became sort of procedural, what we would call in-betweens. And we were just trying to strip all that stuff out, and we were just trying to get to something that felt like a really strong, graphic way of telling a story, like a comic book, but animation. And it has this beautiful history of being incredibly expressive, and we were just trying to bring the computer almost backwards a little bit into that, and be make it feel as individual and as expressive as a person drawing could be.
Mm-hmm. Was there a particular era of the comic book that you looked to for inspiration in terms of the art style, or was it pretty wide-ranging?
We borrowed pretty heavily from everything,
Yeah.
and the artists that inspire us are individualistic. Sienkiewicz, who's like referenced pretty tightly, and but all those the guys that like we grew up reading when we were kids, Mike Mignola, and for me it was like weird guys like Howard Chaykin and Mark Badger and Dennis Cowan, and like guys that were just, you could feel their mark making was that of an individual.
Mm-hmm. But there was never any question of looking back to using Peter as the core character. It was always going to be a Miles Morales story.
It was always going to be Miles. That was like what we wouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm.
Because
and I was just going to say to the question you asked Peter earlier, just about the visuals becoming overwhelming. The thing that we always did, because there were moments where we did overwhelm ourselves with visuals, and we tried to scale back. And our sort of touchstone was, as long as we're being subjective to Miles and making sure that this is still just all about Miles and his origin story and how everything affects that, then it all felt okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if we're split screening things or being,
exactly.
All film school with stuff, it's in service of how he feels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or a comparison or something. Just trying to be as dogmatic with just the idea that we can't put this stuff in here for artifice. It has to serve the story. And that's why a lot of the effects don't start to enter Miles' life until after he's bitten by the spider. Mm-hmm. And then we start to bring in text, and we start to bring in more of the sort of offset printing and spider sense and all that stuff, and panelization. None of that happens to Miles until after he's got his powers.
Tell me about finding the voice cast for this, because you're working with a lot of actors who haven't really done much voiceover at all. I mean, I don't think Mahershala Ali's done any previously, Brian Sri Henry. What were you looking for from them? Were you particularly going to people who didn't have a history in voiceover? Or?
Not by design. I wouldn't say that was ever a coherent decision we made, but we did tend to get the people we wanted. There wasn't a lot of we tended to get the first person we went to or thought of, and over the course of working with the actors, in some cases you just get actors because you think that they're awesome actors and wouldn't it be great. As it happens, a number of them hadn't done voice acting before, and the more we worked with them and the more we saw what the animators were doing with with their performances, really the more we started to direct the actors more, sort of in a more naturalistic or almost quiet way, because we found that the animators were doing were just doing really great work filling in the blanks, essentially. And it helped the writing process a lot, because all of a sudden we saw how much the subtext could carry, and we started, it affected how we wrote, it affected how we were directed in the booth, and in the end a lot of the takes that are in the movie are from our takes where the actors, were again adopting a more naturalistic approach, or were, finding the words in some fashion, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to what Rodney's saying, I mean, a guy like Mahershala, that's just how he works. There was never any question that you could guide him to like, well, you got to animation it up a little or anything like that. He's just giving a 100% committed, pure performance as this character that he's inhabiting.
Yeah, he was method.
Yeah, oh yeah, he's
very method.
Very method.
Behind a mic.
That scene was
I was
kind
gonna
of
say
incredible.
Spoiler alert. But
Sorry.
He did. I don't know. But he did a death scene and he did it 2 times. The first time we recorded that scene, and then once more almost.
That day that you decided not to come.
The day that I was like,
we tried to get number 3.
I don't think I'm gonna go to the record today, because I don't think he's gonna do it again.
Then the flip side is someone like John Mulaney, who, is a brilliant writer. And, for every line of his we have in the movie, we literally have 50 things, 48 of which he genuinely just riffs. And they're, and as a comedy writer, it's like, he improvises things that are like fully formed, like level 900 jokes, like over and over again. But even with that character, in the end, what cemented that character was when we started to push John to find the emotion behind Spider-Ham, as strange as that is, there were a couple key moments even with him where we swerved away from jokes, good jokes, that we had with him, and had him just express something real to the character, and that. So even with him, we found ourselves going in that direction, but we left a lot on the floor. That was amazing.
We were able to get a couple times actors together, which is always really fun. We got Shamik and Jake together a couple times because their dynamic was really fluid and they really did play off each other well. And then we were able to get Brian and Shamik together for their car scene and sit them in the chairs.
That was a big one. Yeah.
And you could feel how annoyed Brian was getting with Shamik for real.
For real.
And
No.
it was
An
delightful.
easy acting gig that day for Brian.
Both films we're talking about at this session have got incredible monorail pursuit scenes or elevated train. It's a really kind of weird common ground.
That's true. I remember when I saw that.
And
I remember he saw your movie over the weekend, and then he came back and he's like, dude, there's a train thing. I don't know. We're like, too late, that one's already done.
Too late.
But I think, the piecing together of a sequence like that, and Brad and Nicole, we can talk about this as well in your part, but like to piece together a sequence like that where you basically got this, effectively with animation, you've got a blank slate to start with, and yet those sequences feel so incredibly grounded in a real environment, even though what's happening in them is so kind of incredibly hectic and extravagant. How does piecing together a sequence like that work? And particularly, does this speak to what you said about certain things being very expensive to achieve? Is something like that with its kind of scope and very far pushed horizons and the enormous amount of visual detail. Does that present an additional cost or challenge to piecing it together?
Well, we did things. Sorry,
I was just say we give no regard for cost.
I know that's
any of
that
the
one
construction
is
of
true,
anything, yeah.
But we did things on that where throughout the whole movie where we you often build large sets in CGI where you go, okay, this is our city, and then you drop down and you start to find your angles, and one of the sort of pipeline breaking things that we were just trying to do as much as we could on this movie was in the same spirit of a comic book panel where you're always just trying to create the best composition and strongest storytelling, so you're moving things around and you're kind of disregarding some continuity. We did that with our sets as well, where that street, the elevated train is, I think it's like, how many blocks? It's like 17 Manhattans long or something, but it's also repetitive, and within each shot, really, truly, it's like the most expensive, like repeating pan you've ever seen. But it really was just a testament to what you could get away with when you cheat. That's the thing about filmmaking is it's at its best when you're cheating and you're finding solutions that are creative, and that's what that whole sequence was.
Sleight of hand.
Yeah, completely.
Feel right.
Yeah, and they just and you watch them together and you don't question it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really just a bunch of tiny pieces of street strung together, and then like some buildings, some taller buildings in the back, real close, and then hey, it's gonna snow, which is gonna give us speed lines, like almost like anime speed lines, and it was just sort of a visual concept that then we just ran with, had a lot of fun.
That sequence is what I like about it is that in a very verbal movie that starts with a screenplay, it's a very board-driven sequence, and one of the things that was really fun for us as filmmakers is this dialogue between like dorks in a coffee shop going, here's a clever line. And then, our great filmmakers taking that notion and just exploring it, and just what is it? Just exploring it in boards, exploring it in animation. It just, it's animation that can express things visually and through motion and performance that are so much more strong than the written word.
There's also Daniel, his score.
Yeah, his score.
Something I was thinking about,
in that particular sequence, Bob and a guy named Alberto Mielgo, who we worked with on the movie, also, went to New York very early in the process and took
a ton of research.
Reference photos. And when I watched that sequence, like, I stood in New York on the exact corner that he and Alberto photographed for that sequence. It's like, the photographs captured a feeling of what New York, what the light and a certain kind of light looks like in New York, and a certain kind of blurriness. And so when I watch that sequence, I just see the reference photos. Our team really matched the photos.
Yeah, they were inspiring because we were just taking sort of, just slightly open exposures, just ever so slightly, and just getting lines from lights and things, and it was just sort of like fed into the idea of, oh, this can be an effects-driven thing, where because we don't have motion blur in the movie, we can use this line work to help the viewer's eyes, so no one goes into a seizure and passes out. That would be bad for the movie, right? So that was also part of just creative solutions. And then Daniel, what I was going to say was Daniel Pemberton, who's local boy right here, did our score. Everything you hear in that is actually, it sounds like just scratching, like record scratching, but it's actually the entire orchestra recorded and then broken apart and put onto vinyl and then scratched to make score. So that it's something that might slip past some people's ears just because it seems like it's just scratching. But there's a lot that went into that too.
Well, we're going to break up and scratch the panel now to shift front row with Sage and vice versa.
Yeah. All right.
Spider-Verse team, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, sure, of course. There's 2 questions.
I'll take this one out and leave these 3
Are we doing to?
Yeah, you'll want to Purell.
Oh, we were gonna lay horizontally across.
And then obviously Robbie's got the clip.
Yes, I will set you. Sure, thank you. Cheers.
Perfect.
There you go. Okay, so from Incredibles 2, please welcome Brad Bird and Nicole Grindle. I think it's kind of amazing to go straight from talking about Spider-Verse to an Incredibles film, because Spider-Verse feels like almost the accumulation of a decade plus of superhero saturation culture, whereas the original Incredibles it predated all of that by about 4 years or something. So I'm really interested when you decide to make a sequel now at this particular point of the culture. What did you feel had kind of changed in the interim, particularly as the film itself? There's no time for change at all. We just go straight from number 1 into number 2. But in the interim, so much has happened.
Well, I mean, it's true, and I actually got fairly depressed about it because when we did the first film, there were only 2 active franchises, and one was Spider-Man and the other one was X-Men. And, Batman, it was post-Nipplegate, and Chris Nolan hadn't done his thing yet. And so we kind of had some elbow room. And now if you throw a rock, you'll hit 7 superheroes, And so I got really depressed for a little bit because I thought, it's saturated now. By the time this movie comes out, people are going to be sick of superheroes. And then I thought, wait a minute, that isn't why I got into the idea in the first place. What I got into, what made me excited about the idea was that it was really a film about a family and through the lens of a superhero rather than about superheroes. And then it became interesting to me again because family is sort of an infinite thing. I mean, as long as there has been storytelling and as long as there will be storytelling, that'll be a really fertile ground. So there was plenty left to do in that instance. And one of the epiphanies of the first film was that when I was picking the powers for the characters, every power had been done, you know what I mean? So I thought, well, I'll do it based on their position in the family. And so dads are expected to be strong, so you make him super strong. Moms are pulled in 12 directions at once, so she stretches. Teenagers are insecure and defensive, so she has force fields and invisibility. And 10-year-olds are energy balls, and babies are unknowns, right? They could have all the powers, they could have none of the powers. So that kind of grounds it. It's using the powers as a way to comment on roles and times of your life. And I think that was one of the things that worked about the movie is somebody can relate to at least two of the family characters. You know what I mean? I mean, I know what it's like to be the annoying kid brother, and I know what it's like to be the bumbling dad, you know, and you know, I was a teenager, so I was insecure, you know, and so there are more ways in, and that's what made it interesting to me.
Did knowing that there was an enormous audience already
it totally excites you because you just think, you know, not what I expected. You know, I mean, there were, you know, the Twitterverse, you know, they better grow up and be really edgy or I'm not in, you know. I mean, it's just like, I think that if you think about it that way, you just want to curl up into a ball and never make anything. But if you just can turn down that yammering thing and just say, what would I like to see, then it becomes an easier question to answer.
And I should say there was a huge group at Pixar who had made the first film with Brad who were really excited to come in and get at it again. So I think we were able to sort of put up the wall and build the moat around the studio and dive into this thing that we had loved making 14 years ago.
Well, and it's also on the first film, there were different dragons to slay. I mean, animation, and Steve Jobs actually kind of picked on this. When you put animation with superheroes, it equaled cheap in a lot of people's minds because, you know, the only big budget thing that had been done were, you know, live action films like Superman and the Batman movie and then Spider-Man and. But animation had always been like cheap sort of Saturday morning, you know, done for $1.98 kind of stuff. And I had to point out to Steve that actually the first superhero on film was animated Superman from the Fleischer Brothers, and they were big budget. I mean, they weren't cheap. They were done really well. And but he was concerned that people would hear animation and superhero and think cheap. And so we had to kind of, you know, plant that idea that we were going to do this as well as we could, you know. And we didn't have, you know, nobody knew our superheroes. They were made for the movies. They didn't have any other life. So there were things that made people nervous. And you know, one of the nice things about sequels is people aren't nervous about them anymore in the same way. Originals make people nervous, you know.
Nicole, what were the kind of sticking points that you found as a producer that people, were there any questions people raised to say, oh, you know, should we be doing this, should we be doing that? Because I think you know, the core of this film, it's compared to the first Incredibles, it's a much freer film. You know, you've got these moments of observational comedy, you've got this kind of out and out Looney Tunes style slapstick and sequences where characters kind of sit down and pour themselves a Negroni and talk about the nature of heroism. You know, it's kind of quite out there stuff compared to.
Says animation all over.
Right, exactly.
Two people sitting down and talking about heroism. Yeah.
But I mean, did you find people saying, okay, so let's maybe steer it in this direction, or how did you reconcile that?
No, I mean, the studio embraced the idea of Incredibles 2 because there had been this drumbeat in the world for so long for Incredibles 2, Incredibles 2, Incredibles 2, when are you going to make it, and had been very patient, actually, until Brad was ready to come back and finish the other projects he was going to do. Our problem was that they changed the release date on us. They moved it up by a year. And so we lost a year of writing. And so suddenly Brad was writing and directing at the same time. And we were taking pages, you know, off of his desk and putting them into production out of sequence. So we didn't really have the entire script understood until we were almost
after
done.
The release, yeah. We waited for other people to tell us what it was about. Yeah.
And sometimes that's the best way to make something, you know. Just don't look down too hard. Just keep making it, and when you look up, it's going to mean something. Yeah. You know, deadlines are an amazing thing.
Yeah, no, it was really hard, but we had some other things that were done Iron Giant was done quickly, and so television had kind of prepared me for the kind of MASH unit, school of filmmaking, where you just like do something and then triage it as quickly as possible,
In terms of the animation, it's really interesting that you bring up the Fleischer Brothers cartoons, because they have this really kind of vivid modernist look, and in the first Incredibles film, that's exactly the aesthetic you go for, but then possibly because, I don't know, the technology then, it lent itself to those big angles and simplified outlines and hyper-readable poses.
Right.
Was there a temptation to move to a different kind of style with the sequel, or were you absolutely dead set, even though there's been this kind of enormous advance in what you can do?
I think that that's the challenge you have when you return to something is, technology has changed, but you want it to feel like it's connected. The difference was that we got to do stuff the way we were trying to do it in the first one, in this one. And, the first movie was a little more, jungle. It was a little more rural, and this movie was a little more urban, And it was more focused on the female point of view, so it was different.
Still pleased to see.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, right, yes, the mic.
Yes.
And even with like Edna Mode's topiary on the drive up to the house, it's still cubic, but it's
right. Well, no time has elapsed. I mean, that that ended up being, I thought, a kind of a weird decision. It was sort of screw you time. We're going to start it 5 seconds after the movie ended, even though 14 years have gone by.
It was wonderful for production when we were going in a hurry. We knew exactly what we were going to work with in terms of sets. Except for the new sets, we could quickly rebuild the old sets while we were figuring out what would happen in them.
But we had to make them a lot better because the technology was better.
Tell me then about these new...
Better, sorry.
Tell me about these new urban sets then, the incredibly complex cityscape, and again, the staging of this monorail chase through the middle of it. What were the visual references for that, the touchstones? I mean, was this kind of...
Well, it was mainly just, you wanted it to feel like they were traveling far. So you wanted to be in the city, then go out of the city, be in the country, and then be entering another city. And so that it felt like they were traveling a far distance in a short period of time. So it was, it's kind of what you do in animation. You try to boil it down to the essence and then heighten that, And but it was a challenge to do it at the speed that it needed to be done and still be coherent, And also, there's an added thing in animation where people are conditioned to think that people are always going to be fine. That Coyote falls off the cliff and just dusts himself off and he's ready to go again. So jeopardy becomes very hard to do in feature animation because everybody's used to people just pounding the crap out of each other and nothing ever happening. So, I tried to engineer in flaws and things that hurt and mistakes. And so that she's not doing everything perfect all the time, that she's, the motorcycle is colliding with the side of a car a little bit. She doesn't judge everything perfectly. And because you can control everything in animation, people like to make it perfect. And so everybody always hits the bullseye when they aim at it. And I always think that's a mistake, because it makes it not connect with what you know to be real, even if what you're doing is fantastical and impossible. If you add in flaws and you add in mistakes, it makes it more visceral.
And this is the kind of thing I think an audience doesn't necessarily consciously register while they're watching the film.
No, but they can feel
somehow,
it.
Right.
And, if you turn around and watch them and they're gripping you've done your job. And that's hard to do in animation because, like I said, there's a lot of conditioning from animation that nobody's ever in danger, nobody can ever get hurt, nobody can ever die, blah, blah, blah,
I have to say, in both the films we're talking about today, that I did feel serious jeopardy. And with yours, the screen slaver character, is this incredibly intense unveiling of that character in its full sinister glory. How, when when you're catering to a wide audience, how do you gauge how far to push that stuff? Because ultimately, with adults, they may be familiar with the Outer Limits source, the inspirations there, and they know to read it in a certain way. But to young kids, that can be pretty
Kids
daunting.
don't listen quite as much. They more feel it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's fine. I got a lot of I got nervousness when I had the first scene that I did in the first film was the argument between Bob and Helen, and it was a marital argument. And I think all the people at Pixar got nervous that I was going to do an animated Bergman film. It's about the unraveling of a marriage or something. And I kept saying, no, this just happens to be the first scene that we're doing. It's not the whole film is going to be what I told you. There's going to be a lot of action and a lot of comedy and stuff. But we have to know that this means something to their life. So there is a certain amount of effort put into that, you know what I mean? Feeling that stuff and not being afraid to do it. And I think people think that kids are going to be bored, and if you keep going there, they're going to be bored. But if they get a sense of the conflict, they can be engaged too. You don't have to dumb everything down for kids. So we just try to make films that we would want to see and then hope that it works for other people. Because if you try to figure out what people of all ages and all circumstances will want 2 years from now, you'll just go somewhere and shoot yourself. But if you can think of what would I like to see on the screen, then it becomes simpler.
Mm-hmm. I think the past 12 months in feature animation have been completely extraordinary. There's this incredible crop of films have all arrived at once. And I was wondering if either of you sort of detected, currents in the industry that would not be obvious to people outside of it that has resulted in this kind of confluence of incredible work in all sorts of styles, stop motion, hand-drawn as well as CG.
Yes.
Well, I would just say that obviously the audiences are turning up for them, so I think that's helped a great deal. Pixar has really worked hard to elevate those story narratives and try to do something that's a little more sophisticated, still for all audiences. But yeah, I'm excited. I love the Spider-Verse film because I feel like there's a lot more going on than just action. There are really deep, interesting, complex characters that have conflicts that I think people are relatable and not for kids. I think for all audiences. And same with Isle of Dogs. A really interesting film that you wouldn't normally think was for kids, but I think all audiences turned up for that as well. So
but
it's appealing for directors.
Yeah, I think more importantly, they're engaging as films. And the more, for me, every time somebody tries to put a barrier between what we do and other film, I want to knock it down. It's just like, no, we're a film. How we get on film is different. But we still have camera angles. We still have characters that hopefully connect with you. We still have to deal with the rhythm of editing and the designing of a world. And, it either works or it doesn't, to talk about it like it's a section of film, it's not a genre. It's a medium. It's a medium that can do any genre. And I like it the more that animators push that. It's like when somebody, if somebody has a prejudice, meaning they think something from something, they expect something. The minute cartoons start going, and all that stuff, I something inside me dies a little bit because that's what everybody expects. That's the animation corner. If you were from another planet and you landed and you couldn't understand language, and you heard, you'd go, it's animation, and anytime animation's not screaming at you and not, having every pose be like, that kind of acting, then I feel like it's more where it should be, because it can be really sophisticated, and yet wonderful in a way that speaks to the child in you no matter what your age is, because there's something elemental and emotional about it, and it's like your feelings more, and that to me makes it a very vital way to make a film. But I don't think it's taken that way as often as it should be.
It is usually more expensive, though, I think, to make these sorts of films because it takes more time.
Yeah,
You
right.
need time to write. You need time to iterate.
But that's also why they tend to be more reseeable than live action. And they tend to age less than live action. If you look at any film from 1961 and compare it with 101 Dalmatians, one of them is going to look old, and it won't be 101 Dalmatians. And it's because animation forces you to distill something.
Yeah.
That distillation lasts longer if it's done well. Animation is more excruciating when it's done badly. It's like watching 24 mistakes a second. It's like Bonnie and Clyde or something. You're being hit by mistakes. But when it's done beautifully, you are getting caressed 24 times a second. And it's just like, it's so good.
The perfect example of this in Incredibles 2 is that when the Pars move into their new home, and there's just this, 5-minute period where you're just luxuriating in that new environment and its possibilities, but you're not, there's not anvils and pianos falling on people's heads. It's so kind of delicately and sophisticatedly done. And who is the architect? Is it Lautner?
He's in there, Neutra, there's a whole bunch of guys, mid-century, modern kind of.
Yeah. So in piecing together that sequence, you're drawing presumably entirely from real worlds.
Yes, and you're also trying to say that this person had a lot of money, but maybe not the greatest taste. You know what I mean? So rocks are amazing. It would have cost a lot of money to take a big rock and move it into position in the room. But maybe it's not quite what you want to live with, So that's why he's falling into water all the time. It may be an artistic statement, but it's kind of hard to live in that thing.
Especially when you have a toddler.
Yes.
It's not a friendly family home.
Right. So it's kind of saying they're there, but it's not, it's much more successful place than the place that they lived in the first movie, but it's really not for them. Really, it's kind of doesn't fit them, Yeah.
We're just about to finish. Nicole, I want to quickly ask you about Sanjay's Super Team, which was the short that you produced directly before Incredibles 2?
It was directly before, yeah.
Yeah, did that give you any fresh perspective on what superheroism stood for, given that it's kind of interpreting religious myth as this kind of superhero story?
I suppose, it's funny, I worked on Aeon Flux a really long time ago, the original one as well, and I think I love that action, kind of someone being able to realize their power in that kind of way, and that's the beauty of animation, so that you can take Hindu gods and do that, with Aeon Flux, she was just this incredible assassin, super cool assassin, but so elegant, and I guess I just love the poetry of that superhero genre, of articulating aspirations in that way. In Incredibles, to see a teenage girl who is suddenly empowered that way. It's a fantasy that I know many teenage girls have, be able to, you're awkward in school and then you kick ass when nobody can see you and they don't know that you have those powers, Sanjay's Super Team was this wonderful experience because it was, you wouldn't expect that of Hinduism, and it was the marriage of a little boy who had grown up watching television with appreciating his father's Hindu religion that allowed him to do that mashup. And, it was the way Sanjay wanted to communicate how much he ended up loving his father's religion and how much he embraced it as an adult. Yeah.
I think in one way or another, superheroes and also things like Iron Giant are dealing with people trying to cope with their own power. Human beings have tremendous power, and they don't totally know what to do with it, and they're constantly wrestling with it being a destructive thing or a positive thing. and you know, we're always going to be. I mean, to this day, we're wrestling with it. We're kind of destroying the planet now just by going through our daily life and having our Fritos and our water shipped in from Polynesia or whatever. We're just kind of enjoying it, but we're not realizing what it does. So I think daily we're wrestling with the questions of what to do with our power. And, you know, what does it mean, you know?
And our aspirational power to bring balance to the kinds of things that we're doing damage to.
Right.
Well, on that philosophical note, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you all so much for coming along.
Really
Cheers.
heavy.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Cheers. Pleasure.